Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Giacalone, and we have a very special guest with us tonight, Alexis Linkletter. Alexis, welcome to the show. I'm going to give you a quick bio, but welcome.
Thank you.
Right, so Alexis, she started out doing this as an executive producer of the podcast Unraveled for the Investigation Discovery Channel, which is now up to 34 episodes, and I think a new episode drops tomorrow, right?
That's right, and you're on it.
All right. Yeah. Well, this is the one I'm on. Okay, great. So, yeah, it's all about the Long Island serial killer case, which we're going to get into tonight. But she's also the executive producer of the First Degree podcast. All the links to all of the podcasts that Alex does is going to be in the chat tonight. The Nightbot will be sending them out. So you guys don't have to worry about it. They'll be on there. So make sure you subscribe to Alexis's podcast. So welcome, Alexis. It's good to see you in person. Well, not in person, but it's good to see you on this kind of thing.
Great to see you too, Joe.
So we're just going to jump right into this. So the Long Island serial killer case, like I said, it's international. It's known everywhere. But what really drew you to getting involved into this whole Long Island serial killer case? What was your actual draw?
So I kind of got involved by accident. I mean, I was very involved in true crime storytelling. I was working as a producer in unscripted TV and I was producing true crime documentaries. But when I first heard about the case and really sort of what was going on behind the scenes of the case was through a man named Christopher Loeb. And those who are really familiar with the case will know that name. He was basically the guy who was responsible for dethroning James Burke as the former chief of police of the Suffolk County Police Department. Chris Loeb and I went to middle school and high school together. So he was in jail at the time when we reconnected back in, I think, 2012, 2013. And we started talking. And I thought initially that this was going to be a story about political corruption, and a smaller story about injustice that Chris Loeb experienced. And once I dug in and started doing research, I realized that there was this Long Island serial killer connection, which was that James Burke had become the chief of police right around the time that the remains of Shannon Gilbert were found in Oak Beach. And of course, also those who follow the case will know that she is the reason any of the victims found along Ocean Parkway were ever discovered. So a huge key figure in this case and a victim in this case. So that's sort of how I got pulled in. I mean, I had been familiar with the case and the story of the victims had resonated with me, but I never knew that I would sort of insert myself in it until then.
Yeah, no, right. When you think about it, both Christopher Loeb and Shannon Gilbert, right? I mean, uncovered so much stuff on Long Island that most of us, especially Long Islanders, couldn't believe all this was happening right in our own backyards, and it was kind of like, wow, like, look, this is crazy.
It really added some additional layers to this case that I think further seduced the public, really. I mean, there are unfortunately several serial killer cases, well known ones across the country, but none quite like this for that reason. I think James Burke really played a pivotal role in causing a lot of confusion associated with the case and, of course, delaying, answers in the case, too.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, it's talk about a total mess, right? I mean, then all the conspiracy theories that have now, developed from this. I mean, it's just been one thing after another. But it's nuts.
It is nuts. And the conspiracy theories are plenty. And, they started back with Chris Loeb. He also made a lot of claims about things he saw in the bag, which caused a lot of confusion for me personally as well back then. So I think it's really amazing that the current Suffolk County Law Enforcement Administration has really led with transparency and cleared a lot of that up. They've done a really good job and, working to undo the mistrust that all that caused.
Let me ask you a question. When the news first broke, because we're almost at a year now, when the news first broke that they arrested somebody for the Gilgo Four, Rex Sherman, in regards to this case, what was your first thought? What was the first thing that popped into your head?
I was stunned. So I found out actually the night before the arrest because I have a friend whose cousin works at the Suffolk County Jail. And I then was up all night. I was actually in New York at the time visiting for work. And I was in shock and I didn't believe it until the first news article broke. And then I remember renting a car and driving out towards Suffolk County headquarters in Yaphank to make it to a press conference. And I just started crying. I just couldn't believe it because I just thought, given the botching of certain elements of the case, that this would never happen. And I just thought about the victims and their families and how unfairly delayed it had all been. And I just was really overwhelmed with emotion. It was a stunning development.
No, even I mean, I was kind of shocked too because at that point I kind of had given up in the respect that this was never going to be solved because I thought that everything had kind of gotten so far away from the cops that there was no way of making that U-turn, so to speak, which we've seen in some grand fashion in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, especially, as more and more information comes out about the evidence they have, you feel relieved, when James Burke and Tom Spoda, the former DA, were in charge, there were all these rumors about evidence being lost, right? Like, we really didn't know what they still had. So I think to then learn that the case against the suspect seems to be really ironclad is also such a relief and so refreshing to see.
Yeah, no, and as the case goes on and on, I mean, we're going to get into a little bit later on about what's going on with the Fry hearings, but it's absolutely amazing the amount of evidence, and I've said this a couple of times. When you think about it, Suffolk County got beat up a lot, and rightly so. I mean, they did some really terrible things. They had some terrible bosses. I mean, you name it. But when we're starting to see some cases that are being solved from evidence that was secured properly from 25 years ago, I mean, you got to give credit where credit was due because without that crime scene technique, we wouldn't even be talking about this case.
Or just the understanding that, while we might not be able to do anything with this now, we may be able to do something with it one day. Just that foresight's very impressive. Even going back to Sandra Costilla, who, of course, Rex Heuermann has been charged with and who was murdered in the early 90s, they kept everything, even though there was nothing to be done with it yet, which is amazing.
Okay, well, since you brought up Sandra, let's get into her case a little bit because as you look at it, right now this is the first case in the series that Rex Sherman's been charged with, right? So it's the very first, 1993, and so it's the oldest, but it totally goes against his MO and everything else that goes along. I mean, how much confusion is that causing you? What has
Caused
caused?
it's caused a lot of confusion because there are several new elements that have been introduced with Sandra Costilla's indictment, right? We have this brand new geographical element, a new location where previously all of the other victims associated with this series of crimes has had some tie to Ocean Parkway, even if other remains were found elsewhere, like in Manorville. Or Hempstead Lake State Park, hypothetically, right? So I think the idea that this victim, Sandra Costilla, was found in Southampton, a fair amount of a distance away from Ocean Parkway, no ties to Ocean Parkway, is really interesting. And, concerning. It's like, okay, so how many more locations of remains are we dealing with? How many more are at play tied to this alleged killer?
Yes, no, and I agree, and the fact that there is about a almost a 13-year gap in between the last victim found and his arrest. I think we all kind of hitting ourselves, so to speak, if we think that this thing just stopped.
Yeah, of course.
So when this whole thing started going down, right? So I remember, that of course the presser and all this stuff and the live from Massapequa Park, whatever. And as I was sitting there watching this, I was like dumbfounded, like this thing came to fruition. Not only it come from to fruition, but like you said, it's coming to a point where I'd hate to be, Michael Brown in his defense trying to even come up with this thing.
Oh, yeah. And, Michael Brown, he's doing his job and he's doing it really well. And I think a lot of these things, the Fry hearing, which is unfolding right now, which is obviously the debate in court over whether the new nuclear DNA evidence will be admitted. He's doing a wonderful job. If he was my lawyer, I'd be happy. He's really fighting.
Yeah.
And people, I've been seeing in the comments all over social media and stuff, people are just like, give it up, Brown. It's like, we need him to fight as hard as possible for that defense in order to have a conviction with integrity. So I think he's doing his job. This is how the system works. But yeah, I mean, I see him sometimes. I'm like, man, that man is sweating. he's working overtime because he's got a
Yeah.
lot on his plate and a lot to try to prove, otherwise against
He's
all
got a
this
lot of, let's
evidence.
put it this way, he's got a lot of battlefronts, right?
He's got a lot of battlefronts.
He's got a lot of battlefronts. And you know what? Like you said, I mean, I tell people this all the time. He's doing what you want your defense attorney to do. If you were in trouble, you would want your defense attorney to do exactly what he's doing. So it's not about liking him or disliking him or how could he do that. That's his job. That's part of us as being American citizens to be able to have a competent defense attorney if we ever find ourselves in trouble.
Absolutely. And burden of proof is on the prosecution. And they're obviously taking that really seriously, between the physical evidence, between this alleged planning document. They have a lot to work with.
Yep. And like I said, so the Nightbot is putting the podcast links out there. So make sure you check out Unraveled and the First Degree podcast. We're talking, if you just joined us now, we have Alexis Linkletter. Uh, so when we're dealing with, the Fry hearing right now, I think it's got to be probably coming to a close now, but it actually pushes off the idea of a trial. I always thought, I was hoping for maybe like a late July kind of thing, but any ideas or any guesses on your part when this thing can kick off?
That's a great question. I was wondering the same thing. I was like, well, when is it going to go if this Fry hearing drags on for another month? Because I don't even know if the defense has called their witnesses
Yeah,
yet. There has
they're not done yet. Yeah.
Right. So it just, I guess, depends on how many other big cases Suffolk County might be dealing with, because I think they're expecting this trial to go on for months. So they've got to
Oh, yeah.
clear their schedule. So maybe next year, honestly.
Yeah, no, I mean that's originally I was hoping for late July, and then I said, well, maybe in the fall. But now I'm like, I think I'm kind of firmly in your camp. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe by Christmas time or June or New Year's, that we're going to get this thing because as this Fry hearing starts piling up with all these experts that are going out there and talking about this, it's just the fight is just going back and forth, and Fry kind of tries to eliminate that kind of stuff too. So it's going to be interesting to see how this goes. And remember, this is just for the DNA, folks, right? So those who are listening, this is just on the DNA. We haven't heard anything about search warrants yet, or map hearings. We haven't heard any of that.
Right. And there's also been motions filed by Michael Brown to attempt to sever the cases. So that hasn't been determined yet either. So I'm thinking after the Fry hearing, they'll move into that afterwards. So, and then if it's like, you're right, if it's fall, okay, once you hit the end of November, it's the holidays.
Yeah,
It's like we might as well just
courts
do it
shut down. Yeah,
might as well do it in February.
yeah. The courts aren't going to want to get involved in the start of this thing right before the holidays. No way,
Right.
no how. So then we would definitely be looking at a January kind of thing.
Definitely.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? It makes sense when you think about it at this point, because if not, you're trying to rush this thing into the court docket, and it's just going to be too long. This is going to be like you said, 3 or 4 months. I'm anticipating for this thing.
God, just think about the number of witnesses, think about all if they don't sever these cases and all 7 who Rex has been charged with, these victims are all tied to this prosecution. There's family members for each of them. There's witnesses for each and every one of these people who were loved. And then all the science, the investigators. I know they were, Michael Brown talked about bringing up Burke as part of his defense. I'm
Oh
just
yeah,
like, my
he's
mind
definitely doing
explodes.
that.
Oh, yeah, well, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you have to.
You
He
have to.
James Burke is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, for crying out loud, he is. If you're the defense, you're going to try to inject him every which way but Sunday. And then you got Spoda too. I mean, you have the 2 top law enforcement officials at the time who both went to federal prison, and that's a check in the box for the defense as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it's been pretty astounding to me how much trouble Burke has gotten in since the dust settled. I mean, I wouldn't say it's settled. That we all know, those who follow the case, that Burke is forever tied to the botching of this investigation. But he's been in trouble with the law a couple of times, and the mind boggles. Really, it's like he can't stay out of trouble, and it's fascinating.
And I'm surprised that no one's actually, has tried to interview him at
Oh,
all. I mean,
everyone's
oh, they've
tried.
tried.
Yeah, everyone's tried, and his lawyer has always been like, my client literally has no it does not benefit him at all,
Right.
to speak. And especially as long as there's something pending against him in the legal process, he can't. And now it's like he's
Right.
facing charges of, indecent exposure and things like that for
Yeah,
what he
that's the
did.
least of his worries.
Yes, exactly.
That's the least of his worries. Jenny's welcome to the membership. Thank you very much. Um, when this thing finally goes to trial, are you going to be there in
Oh
person? Are
yeah.
you gonna?
I'm going
Yeah.
to be there the whole time.
Oh gosh, yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be planning on taking a trip out there myself. But it's going to be a circus. I believe the first day is going to be absolutely crazy.
I know it's going to we're going to have to line up really early to get there, and it's going to just be really hard, when this arrest happened, my mind, like I said, immediately went to the victims and just like this hope for them to finally get justice. But a whole new painful journey started for them, and this trial will be yet another one. All of the evidence that we've seen in these bail documents and these superseding bail applications is just the beginning. We're going to learn so much more about the evidence, which is going to paint a clearer picture of what the alleged suspect did, the alleged monster. And I think it's going to be really tough to stomach.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Speaking of that, I've been, you and I have spoken, of course, to do the podcast and stuff, but those 400 or 500 digital devices that they found, that's the kind of stuff where you're going to have to take a seat and bring out the popcorn, because I think we're going to learn so much about his communication with not only the victims, but other people else involved in that. And I think it's going to be absolutely frightening for a lot of people to actually hear exactly what he was up to.
Oh, and frightening for the people who had very close encounters,
Escaped.
who escaped unknowingly, right? Like canceled at the last minute or whatever it was. And I just, there's this whole web of events that are behind every horrible act like this. And we only have a snapshot into that right now. And we're going to get a huge, clear picture of that.
Yes. Just wanted to take a quick, Jeannie, thank you very much for gifting those memberships to the channel. I really appreciate that. Uh, when this trial, like I said, it goes on, the evidence with with the digital stuff, the forensics, it's going to be a show in the respect that a lesson about how well, when law enforcement actually works together, what they put together. Now, I'm still torn up about where all this stuff happened, because they're saying pretty much it happened in his house when his wife was away and that kind of stuff. But there's at least one case, I believe Valerie Mack is the case, where they said that didn't happen at the house.
Did they
So
say that in the documents?
yeah, I believe so.
I
Which
missed
is
that, but that's really interesting.
right. So that's what, if that's the case now,
Did
you
they
know,
say it explicitly, or is it something you were able to deduce based on,
no, I
he's
believe, yeah,
very careful with his language, Tierney.
no, I definitely, I remember reading it. I think in the document that was dated, I think it was the one in December.
Mm.
But I'll double check. But
No,
I
I
know
mean,
Raul is in here. He can fact check this. But I believe it's Valerie Mack was the only one that they says didn't go to the house.
wow.
So to me, that's kind of interesting. But we will double check that for sure. Uh, This Fry hearing, I said, if everything goes through, I think it opens up the floodgates, because New York is a very liberal state in regards to allowing DNA evidence in. We've seen them fight Las Vegas, right? Wanted the DNA for this guy and everything else, and they just kind of fought this stuff tooth and nail. So
Yeah. And I think we'll see justice for a lot of other cases too, and you more than anyone knows just like the vast number of cold cases New York has on shelves waiting for some new advancement just like this to push it over the finish line.
yeah, no, it's exciting in that respect. And then Asian male doe, the last unidentified victim from Gilgo. Othram gave out a little bit of a teaser there and said, but that they're basically working on that case too.
Yeah, and Ray Tierney, the district attorney, in an interview said something when he was asked about the identities of both Peaches at the time, who we now know as Tanya Jackson, and Asian Doe, and he said they're not publicly identified, which, I was talking to some of my other colleagues who obviously are interested in this, and They took that to mean that, similarly to what we experienced with Tanya and Tatiana, that they may have identified Asian doe and we just don't know the identities yet publicly. Like, we haven't been told, but they know.
Yeah, no, I mean, with Tanya and Tatiana, I've been saying it for over a year or so that I thought they had them identified, and that's because of all the clues that were given out. The FBI with the Mobile, Alabama Police Department putting out that Facebook page and a post. But the Asian male doe is one of those. It's part of this thing that has been the most secrecy, I think, out of all of the investigations that go on, and I can't get a feel for exactly what's going on with that case.
Well, and I think there are so many questions, right? There are so many similarities between the victims associated with this case. And there were a lot of, there was a lot of elusive elements regarding, Tatiana and Tanya and Asian doe. And I think there's no question as to why, right? We had some outlier circumstances and criteria associated with these cases. And I think, obviously, with the MO variation with Asian doe, and also just the confusion about the gender, that has sort of been, law enforcement has never really committed, right, to
Mhm.
the gender identity of this victim, because it's hard to know without knowing who they are and their
Right.
identity, right? So I think that has added like a lot of mystique around the status of this victim and their case.
No, absolutely. And when you think about it, Rex's own Google searches kind of get involved in that whole area too. So I think that's what kind of raised a lot of hopes in regards to maybe having that case tied to it. So yes, Flynn Brown says Ray Tierney, I'm assuming, doesn't always poker face, with his identity. Yeah, he has some tells.
Yeah, he does.
Ray
And
Tierney has some tells.
I think, to your point about the Google searches and what was put in the documentation that was made available to the public, like the bail applications, I think that was so deliberate. Like the pornography searches and the search terms that were allegedly being used. I think they did that as a nod to the public to say, and this is obviously just speculation, that, hey, we law enforcement believe that he's responsible for Peaches, now Tanya and Tatiana and Asian doe. Like, I really think that's why they did that. Whether or not they would have the evidence to charge the suspect with all of that in this proceeding, they weren't sure at that point. But I think they did that to let us all know that they think he did it. Even though I know, like at the press conference for Tanya and Tatiana, Nassau County said, we're open to other suspects, other possibilities. But I
Sure.
think you have to say that for when you get to trial, because otherwise the defense will say they had tunnel vision on my client. They didn't look at any other possibilities. So that's why they're saying there are, and we're going to look into them, and that's the right thing to do. But I think we all have a
Yeah.
feeling about who did it.
Well, the court of public opinion doesn't have those rules. So we know that
Correct.
the court of public opinion is vicious at times. But like I try to tell, you need to have the evidence in order to prove it. But I kind of like their chances on that on the Peaches case, charging someone, right? Because of the fact that it was in a container, there was tape, there was a blanket, there was a bed sheet, a pillowcase, I believe. The chances of having another mistake where evidence was attached inside that, I think is pretty good.
I think you're right, especially because the remains were found relatively shortly after they believe they were placed there along the road in Hempstead Lake State Park. And right, it's just giving law enforcement a very contained evidence box, essentially, to sift
Yeah.
through. And I think you're right. I think they're going to find something, because initially my thoughts were, well, if they had physical evidence, wouldn't they lead with that, right? Maybe an indictment. They've had this evidence at the very least, well, since 1997. They've had a suspect in custody since July of 2023. Wouldn't they have tested hairs if they had them? Is there a reason they're holding them back? Maybe. Ray Tierney also said that they are done with the investigation phase for the victims that Hewerman has been charged with. That doesn't mean they're done with the phase for these other victims, right? So I don't know what you can decipher law enforcement language. Like, what do you think it all means?
Yeah, I think that they're looking long and hard at him, but I think that the district attorney has got his orders from the judge, Tim Mazie, saying enough. We have enough going forward, and because Peaches is in a different jurisdiction, it would just be an add-on thing down the road. They're not going to hold, even if they identify, let's throw somebody, John Smith as the suspect in that case, then they'll go through it and charge John Smith in a separate trial, and then Suffolk County would have to then wait to do Tatiana's case because she's in Suffolk County. But if
Mm.
it ends up that Rex gets charged with this somehow, there's evidence that proves that. I don't think they're going to hold another trial. It'll just be like they'll just hold it in abeyance. And if something happens with the current trial going out there and he gets off somehow, then they will levy charges on him. But I can't see the state spending the money to do it again if this guy gets convicted on 7
Really? You
homicides.
don't think Nassau might want to have their own trial?
Nope.
Interesting.
No, I don't think so. At this point, what's the point, right? I mean, you just drop the paper on it, and you say if he ever gets out from his 7 life sentences, right? So if there's life after death, they get him for 7 life sentences, and then we'll get him for the 8th when he comes out. So I think that's the way they're going to go with it. I just don't see him spending the money on it.
You know, who knows with this case?
But yeah, well, who knows? But we'll see. But Nassau County. I mean, do you think of anything of the timing of the Nassau County thing? Like, do you think they're waiting to see what's happening with the Fry hearing? That could be a reason if they do have DNA, right? See how that goes first before they push forward.
That's actually a really great point because maybe they did do this nuclear DNA testing with Estrella Labs, which is obviously the lab that is doing the testing for Suffolk County. And maybe they're like, well, if it's going to get thrown out, it's not enough to indict, you know? So yeah, I think that timing is really interesting. Um, Especially nearing the end of the Fry hearing, right? Because, it was going on at the same time this press conference happened with the identity of Tanya and Tatiana. In fact, Ray Tierney wasn't even there because he had to be in court for the Fry hearing. So yeah, you're right. There is something really interesting about the timing and how that's all lining up.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a possibility, right? I mean, when you ask me, like, what you think they could be holding back, I think that maybe they're just holding back on seeing what happens because I've seen this happen before, where they say, okay, let's wait to see, they're going first, let's see what happens, because at this point you got nothing to lose. He isn't going anywhere.
Right. Right. And, speaking about Tanya and Tatiana, because those are sort of the biggest bombshell developments,
Mhm.
them getting their identities back and learning a little bit about them as human beings. Um, what you and I talked about, and we'll really delve into in the episode of Unraveled tomorrow, was the car and how that's a variable here that we haven't seen yet with any of the other cases associated with the Long Island serial killer investigation. What are your thoughts and like what observations have you made about the car? Because you said some really interesting stuff last time we talked about it.
Yeah, to me, I think the car, just from the law enforcement perspective, when they first mentioned it, and she was driving a black, Chevy Storm, and I'm like, who cares? And when I first heard it, I'm like, what does that have to do with the investigation? And then when they said it again, and they said, I think they said it like 4 times, and then they showed the pictures and they put it. I said, this car has a lot more to do with this case than they're leading on. So the question comes down to, was it a meetup? Did he meet up with this, whoever the suspect is, meet up with Tanya, and she unfortunately brought Tatiana with her on this meetup? And is that how it goes? Did the suspect drive this car? Did they drop it off? I mean, there's all kinds of things that we don't want to spoil tomorrow, but when we get
Yeah.
into it, but that there is something definitely afoot with that car, and I think we will definitely learn what it is about it if they solve this case.
And how hard is it? What a criminal, if they realize, like, is that just another mistake, right? Like, is it just like, oh no, I have to get rid of this car? And how hard is it? I mean, you have this vast law enforcement experience. How hard is it to make a car disappear without getting in trouble?
Yeah, not on Long Island because you got the state police, you got the park rangers at Hempstead Lake State Park, you got and you have the Nassau County Police. So you have 3 different police agencies working around this. If this car was dropped off somewhere and the police didn't put 2 and 2 together back then, the question comes down to, was the car towed away? Did it go to a facility? Does that car still exist now? No, it won't. I mean, they're not going to hold a car for 30 years almost, because they didn't know at the time it was part of a homicide. If they did, they would have, which would have
Yeah.
been interesting aspect of that. But I think that we're going to definitely hear about what is going on with that vehicle. There's got to be a reason for them to keep on repeating it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got to hold on to our hats because the bombshells just keep coming, and it is so amazing. I was really worried, when we heard almost 2 years ago, I would say, that they were close to IDing Peaches and her child, that when it kept getting delayed, I just was like, maybe they're not going to do it. Maybe it's not going to happen. And it's just
Yeah.
it's just, you know, it's right for them to have their names. We need to know who they are. And like learning about who Tanya has been really eye opening, right? It's like all the steps that led her to New York, and so much mystery still persists about what happened and how she crossed paths with this, monster.
Right. And yeah, how she got involved in this, whatever. The police did not lead on to anything. They didn't give out any clues, but once again, the public opinion, throws their 2 cents in. And they might be right, they may be wrong, but we have to wait till see exactly what happened. Now, you were asking me a question before about, the vehicle and stuff like that, which is interesting, and about how this would be the second case in the row. Let's just say if Rex was charged with this one of it would be the second case, right? So Sandra Costilla, number one, and this would be the 97 case. But one thing that we do know that the suspect did was read John Douglas's book, Mindhunter. And
Mm.
in Mindhunter, I've read it. I've read it and then reread it and then took all notes. But one of the things that John Douglas does talk about is that, always looking at the first cases in the series, because that's where the most mistakes happen. And that's why I think we're dealing with this car. This was a big mistake. Somebody couldn't help themselves. Somebody couldn't control their urges, and this has become a huge problem for him. Not only does the baby, but the vehicle. I mean, talk about a double whammy, so to speak, when you're doing it. But from the investigative standpoint, I think that's where we're leading into it. That these were big mistakes, and it could help us identify who's responsible.
Yeah, we hope, right? And we know, like, I feel like we already know, but we just hope that the good work that the DA and, the task force has been doing continues, because they probably know as well that one person is responsible for all of these victims. They just have to prove it.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I was a one serial killer person from the beginning, just because, and as a Long Islander, talk about a remote place, right? I mean, you just don't stumble upon Gilgo Beach. You just don't.
Not only that, it's like you have to be from Long Island and have been there. On a map, it looks like a huge area. It
Yeah,
is not when you're there. It is a tiny one road, and it's so specific, and it's like a strip of land between the road and the water. You wouldn't think it's a good place for this. You just wouldn't actually. You'd have to like know this terrain and understand the tides to not worry about, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like someone with no ties to this area would think this is a horrible place to do this. You'd really have to understand the geography and the shorelines and, the tides and like the foliage to know what a great hiding place this would be. So yeah, I was the same way. I always presumed that it was a one perpetrator situation. And I really believe that the evolution with the, choices that were made to hide the remains was an evolution, really. Like, because we see this consistent characteristic with dismemberment with the earlier victims, and then that stops, right? At a certain point. I think you were the first one who ever offered up a really good reason that I had never considered, um, which was, I believe you said it was because he was probably meeting those earlier victims in person.
mhm,
So there was a heightened importance to disguise the identity of the victim,
right.
which I had never considered as a possibility.
Right. Yeah. No, I had referred to it as, basically the countermeasures for them to identify 'em, because you pick them off the street, somebody could see them get into a car, one of their girlfriends, one of their friends, or whatever, or she said, "Oh, I'm getting picked up. He's driving this type of vehicle." and and gone. So he had to do some of those countermeasures in order to prevent somebody from saying, "Yeah, I saw her get into this vehicle." And then technology changes everything. Cell phones, the anonymous nature of that, plus the internet. I mean, picking girls off of a website instead of picking them off a street corner, it meant all the is all the difference for him. And that's why I think we saw different MOs. But MOs change, even though we had people fighting that in the media,
Oh yeah.
about MOs change. And I was kind of like shaking my head and saying like, what are you talking about? Of course they change, they learn, they adapt, they overcome. They don't want to get caught. They want to keep on doing what they're doing.
Well, also, as we know with the alleged planning document, the suspect wrote a note about how they were going to try to mislead by switching things up.
Mhm.
So not only do MOs just organically change because serial killers unfortunately are also human beings, and just like humans change, they do also, but this suspect also allegedly explicitly wrote that they were going to try to throw law enforcement off by switching things up. So no surprise there really at all.
Yeah, no, and when you look at that planning document, I mean, he had the number of security cameras. I mean, he was doing his homework. He understood it, but still made mistakes, which is a good thing for law enforcement in that respect. But all this planning still wasn't able to. That's why when students ask, okay, is there such thing as the perfect crime? No, there isn't.
There isn't. And he's just also very lucky, the suspect. It was like a perfect storm of neglect, distractions. Cause like even when James Burke, for example, got in trouble, was arrested, it was still just a distraction from the case, right? There were law enforcement resources going towards prosecuting him, where it's just so many things had to happen for him to get away, the suspect, with this for as long as he did.
Yeah, talk about dysfunction, right? Dysfunction, corruption, you name it. I mean, this was and I think that's what actually emboldened him, though, and I think that might have been the reason for him making other mistakes, because all these hair follicles and all these things found on certain things was somebody who really didn't. I don't think was worried about getting caught at a certain point. He was just getting away with it for so long. Then he says, you know what, and all the stuff going on out there, which to me I think also forced him to be more Suffolk County related than anywhere else at a certain point in his career. Let's put it
Well,
that way.
yeah, and I think that's why at a certain point he only starts using Ocean Parkway as a place to hide remains, because no one's finding them there. Where in Manorville, for example, he's been charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack. Those torsos were found relatively quickly. Um, we see with Peaches, prior to her identity being revealed, that torso is found relatively quickly. However, the appendages that are hidden along Ocean Parkway are not found in Peach's case for, a very long time, more than a decade. And with the others, again, like he's like, okay, no one finds them here. I don't even need to dismember. But I guess he probably realized at a certain point there's no point because of DNA analysis. You could
Right.
just figure out who someone is. He's like, he's figured out if they find them, they're going to identify them. So I don't need to bother with this extra step. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I
and I
didn't think
when
he
you
was worried about it, because even after the remains are found, another decade goes by, nothing. He's just carrying on. So big question, do you think the suspect, alleged Long Island serial killer Rex Heuermann, murdered people after the discovery of the remains along Ocean Parkway?
Oh yeah, the April 2011, the last victim was found. I'm sure there was maybe a cool off period there that we're dealing with, but to stop for 12 years after doing what he was doing, I find that hard to believe. I find it hard to fathom that somebody could just stop and just go away. It's not like he aged out like we've seen with a couple of other people, like with Joe D'Angelo out in California there, the Golden State Killer. He just aged out. He was got too old for it. But that's what. Yeah, I think I might have mentioned this to you when I started a near riot in Nassau County, when I said, when they I had just threw it on Twitter. I said, well, if I would be looking at the Bethpage State Park area, the entire Massapequa Preserve, whatever. Oh boy, I didn't make any nice people live there. But I mean, he's right around the corner from his house.
Yeah, and if it's too hot in Suffolk County, and it's, do you think that he would then change back to an older MO, to make it seem not like, because we know obviously the victims known as the Gilgo 4 were the most recent in the series that we're looking at. Um, we know he allegedly likes to mislead. So it just creates a lot of questions about where he might have, where we should be looking. I think that was a
Right.
good hypothesis. Why didn't people like that?
Well, because they would have to go and search that entire
Oh,
1,500
just
acres.
the size. Yeah. I
You know.
mean, it's like a needle in a haystack. Like, I think we were talking about this last conversation where it's like there might be more remains along Ocean Parkway that are just buried too deeply and just aren't going to be found. It's
Yeah.
very hard to search terrain like this.
And Hurricane Sandy didn't help either, right? So that entire area was underwater for a number of days too, and that could wash away stuff. But you had mentioned something earlier about how good of a place that Gilgo turned out to be, a good hiding spot, and it's because of that water, right? So you get the low tide twice a day, and you get that smell that can cover up just about anything. And I think because they were not that far from the road, right? Now you can't get there, but back in the day, it was just grass and the bushes or the bramble, whatever they want to call it. And not to be able, everyone's got their windows rolled down, the tops down on the convertibles, and not to smell something that you would say, "What is that?" And I think most people just dismissed it as, "Oh, it's just the ocean. Must be the tide changing of the tide."
Yeah, and there are other variables about Ocean Parkway that also just make it great, like pedestrian traffic super low. They've got like a bike path there now. I doubt people really use
Yeah.
it. I mean, it's like, and there's nowhere to stop. There's literally, the Gilgo Beach Inn, and that's it. So people speed down this road. They go more than 60 miles an hour. You're not really going to smell it if you're going that fast. You might in the beginning, in the first year, first summer, but it's really easy to excuse it with, what you just mentioned. So I think it just really was a very well selected spot, unfortunately.
Yeah, and when you think about it, all 10 sets of remains are on the north side of Ocean Parkway, which would indicate that our suspect came down the Sunken Meadow Parkway right there on the northbound, and then right up the Wanto Parkway, right back to Massapequa. I mean, that's basically the easiest path to go. I mean, I know the original theories when they first started coming out, like, oh, he used a boat, whatever, this and that. Yeah, no, that's not happening.
No, because
Take
even
it
with
from
the,
somebody who had a boat on the South Shore. Talk about dangerous.
yeah, and like you're going to get stuck, you're going to get caught. And I don't know. I went out there when we were filming the Unraveled TV show. I went out there, our team went out with Dominic Barone. And we have footage of him demonstrating how he believes the suspect placed the victims there. And you couldn't do it from a boat. It's destabilizing, right? Like this person, and Ocean Parkway is great for another reason in that if it's night, you can see a car coming from like 3 miles away. You really can, which means you can get out of Dodge before someone's going to see you.
Yeah, and it wouldn't take long either if you're strong enough to, we're talking 100 pounds picking them up. And, they weren't really placed too far in the bramble because you couldn't get into the bramble. So, and I've spoken to a couple of people who are canine handlers for the cadaver dogs, and they said if they were probably another 5 feet further into that bramble, the dogs wouldn't have been able to pick up the scent, and you wouldn't have been able to get to them anyway.
God, that's amazing, right? Isn't it? Just imagine if they hadn't been found, how different everything would be, and how many more victims potentially we'd be looking at. It's really a scary, heartbreaking, prospect.
Yeah, and if you look at the area where the Gilgo 4 were left, there was a large area between that and the water. So the bramble was like pretty thick when you take a look at it. So I mean, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there was a Google Map stuff going on where he was looking for specific areas because they were all lined up within close proximity to one another. Not just the Gilgo 4, but everybody else too.
Right. And we know that the suspect believes he's really tech savvy, with his burner phones and his IP, different emails, fake names. He's Googling the podcast about him. He Googled Unraveled. They put that in the bail document. He's, paying attention, and he Googling John Bitrolf.
Yeah.
He's just saw himself as really advanced.
Oh, I agree, and I think, like I said, I think it was some of it of arrogance too and cockiness. I mean, he had all those newspaper articles, which once again ties totally into John Douglas's book too about how they're going to follow the investigation, and also, the one thing that is in that book, which we haven't heard yet, was that hanging out in cop bars and those kind of things, trying to get what's going on in the investigation. However, he lived around the corner from the Nassau County Police Academy, so that's an interesting little tidbit there too in regards to the makeup of this guy. I mean, we might find out when all is said and done, he might be one of the most prolific serial killers we've ever seen. In the history.
I think we're inching in that direction. I think every time, and we shouldn't get desensitized to it because, like, we all lived and sat with the shock of his arrest for a while. And then it's like I remember seeing that the superseding bail document with the planning document. I was like in shock for probably 2 weeks. Like that, I couldn't believe that we were getting such a clear picture of a monster, and how he allegedly sees himself, right? He took quotes from the John Douglas book about don't look at the painting, look at the artist, or, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like he really is pleased with himself. And it's so disturbing. I don't recall seeing evidence quite so explicit in any other case. It's really just truly
and
shocking.
and it was there for the taking from investigators too. That's the thing that I think aggravates a lot of people, including myself, right? The phone records and the pings from Massapequa, the calls to the Costello sister. I believe it was the Costello sister, right?
Oh, Melissa Bartholomew.
Melissa Bartholomew, thank you. Her sister, and basically torturing her again with what had transpired. I mean, tracking him down into Manhattan. I mean, they had everything. They had the box in Massapequa. They had the box in Manhattan. And you just kind of shake my head. Like, I took the Long Island Railroad for years, and then all of a sudden you say yourself, did I ever come across him? Because at the time I used to get off at the Wantaw train station, which then you had Seaford, Massapequa, Massapequa Park. There's only three more stops after that, because I used to live in Wantaw, and basically the Long Island Railroad was in my backyard. I used to walk home from work, but and then because there was pictures of him on the Long Island Railroad.
Oh, have you seen the TikTok video of the girl who posted, like, it was some trend, like, little did I know I was sitting next to a serial killer, and because she had taken this clip of him because I think he was creeping her out. And then after the arrest, she realized, like, that was the guy I was sitting next to on the train, and he was drinking a beer out of, like, a brown bag and, like, on his iPad. And it's just disturbing. It's just so disturbing.
Well,
I
yeah,
still
and it
I
goes to
still
show
can't
you.
believe it.
Just goes to show you, you don't know who you're rubbing elbows with at any given time. Especially. Well, listen, a beer on the Long Island Railroad wouldn't be a big deal, right? Because they have bar cars, or they used to have bar cars on the Long Island Railroad, and you could do this stuff or pick it up at Penn Station, and then read the paper, or your iPad going back. But yeah, a lot of people. I'm sure there was. We haven't heard too many more stories about that. Any encounters with him on the Long Island Railroad, which was kind of interesting, because he's a big dude. He just doesn't. He's not one of the type of people you just see and you forget because of the fact that, oh, he looks like everybody else.
Yeah, and you really don't know who you're rubbing elbows with. And I think, I continuously also think about his family and just like the rug pull they've experienced as a result of this, and how hard it's got to be, to just look back on decades of your life in confusion, right? And just like probably beating yourself up, probably feeling like an idiot, or not, or being in total denial because your brain needs to protect you. It's a defense mechanism. I try to really empathize with whatever path they take towards healing, because it's just like we can't fathom what our brains might do to protect us from these realizations. Or the psychology of it, I think, is really interesting. Like, so much of the way they're grieving or processing this is not in their control. Like, their brain is protecting them from, like, the emotional catastrophe, which it is. Imagine every time your husband's sending you off to Comic-Con or whatever, he's really doing that to get you out of the house to do this in your house that you share. It's just like unfathomable.
Yeah, no, I mean, and she becomes victimized herself in so many aspects of this too. I know there's lots of discourse about that online too, but I don't want to get into the weeds on that thing. But
No. And she hasn't handled this flawlessly, right? She's made a lot
oh
of
no,
questionable statements and, but traumatized people do weird things, man. They really do. And we have to
yeah,
remember that he handpicked her allegedly. He murdered before her. He would have picked a partner who he could get away with this with. He just would. That's how sociopaths and psychopaths that's how they think. It's all by design.
yeah, no. I mean, well, have you heard anybody even try to interview the first wife?
I'm sure people have tried. I'm sure people have
Because that
tried.
that to me is a treasure trove of information and insight about what was going on. Because that ended in a divorce.
Well, and you mentioned Joe D'Angelo earlier. So I worked on a series for HLN called Unmasking a Killer. That was a 5-part series prior to the arrest of Joe D'Angelo. And then we did a follow up, 2 or 3 hours. And it clicked, like so much clicked because we had one victim of him prior to his identification saying, he kept saying the word Bonnie, Bonnie. And then once D'Angelo's arrested, we learned that he was engaged to a woman named Bonnie and then called off the engagement. And so, to your point, like the ex partners are a treasure trove. Um, and I'm sure more will come out. I do wonder if she will testify in the trial, especially since they alluded to her hair possibly being found on Sandra Costilla and alluded to the idea of Sandra Costilla's murder, Sandra Costilla's murder coinciding with the divorce. Um, so we might get those answers at the trial if they're called to testify.
Yeah, no, I would be interesting to see how that goes on, and also too, I mean, we might see an appearance by James Burke getting called in as a possible witness to something too. I think the defense would love to try to call him. I don't know if he'll make the list, but the
He
defense
might
would want
show
him, I'm
up and
sure.
just plead the fifth a million times. He has no, the self-incrimination no longer applies because he's already gone to jail for what
Right.
prison, but he won't. There's no
Oh no.
reason for him
No,
to
I hear you.
actually weigh in. I mean, maybe he will. Oh my gosh. I hope he does. That would be fascinating. But
Well, I mean, we do know that he definitely likes talking about himself, right? He thought when he was in charge of the Suffolk County Police Department, there wasn't a camera he didn't like. So
oh yeah.
who
I mean,
knows?
he played the part. He's a charismatic guy and he had a lot of secrets and still does evidently. But
Oh
he's
gosh.
he's
Yeah.
still, I grew up in Smithtown, right behind his house, and he still lives there. Um, I've heard stories about him going into, the delis in St. James. People are seeing him around. So,
Well, I didn't recognize him when he got arrested out in that Bald Hill incident. I didn't even
no.
recognize him.
He
He
looked
lost so
really
much
old.
weight.
He
Yeah,
looked
he lost so
old. I
much
mean, I
weight.
guess that happens. People age, right? But he looked completely different to me. I agree. Like um he really did look very like diplomatic
Different.
and he
Yeah.
looked like a politician. He really played the part so well when he was in office, in his position rather. Yeah, no, it's very fascinating to see how the mighty have has fallen.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, when you look at all the different characters involved in behind us, and then years of even new people in charge, and nothing really happened. I mean, the best thing that we got was the belt, right? Was it in 2020 or 2019? I don't remember exactly when. But when Geraldine Hart, the then police commissioner, holds up that belt, right, with the WH or the HM, whatever they had originally had said it was. I mean, that was the only thing we had ever gotten out of that case in like 9, 10 years.
It was really shocking. Speaking of the belt, did you remember? I remember, I think it was recently, Michael Brown has been saying in his press conferences about the idea that Suffolk County was coming like this close to arresting a different suspect, um, whose initials apparently matched, who I think also was apparently former law enforcement. Did you ever hear those rumblings at
Yes,
the
well,
time?
Yeah, I think even Tim Sini at the time had mentioned that they were looking into another person. But you know, from the law enforcement perspective, I said that's a good thing because when you do an investigation, you want to be able to exclude all others. So the fact that they had another suspect and they were looking at him, and then the evidence didn't show it, dismissing that part of the case and going on in a different direction, I think is good for their investigation overall because now it shows, yes, we didn't focus in just on this guy. We were looking at him or looking at somebody else, but all the evidence turned around, boom, forensically turns to this guy, and that's where we focused in on then. So I think it's actually good for the prosecution's case.
I wonder if that suspect will be called as a witness. Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of people I think that might get called into here, right? Especially if Shannon Gilbert's name shows up. There's going to be a number of people that I think it's gonna be like a replay of everything from the very beginning. And for those that aren't involved, you make sure you check out the Unraveled podcast because all these characters are in there already from beginning to end.
And I am glad you brought up Shannon Gilbert because her name is one that we haven't heard enough of. Because there haven't been charges in her case, I feel like people aren't talking about her as much. And it's so important to remember just like all the heroic elements involved with Shannon, her herself, her family. Without them, there's no justice for any of these
Yep.
people, and I think the magnitude of that should never be forgotten, because there are so many murky elements of Shannon's case and there are characters behind the scenes that are, you know, I'm just not sure what's going to happen with that case. I'm hopeful that there are more answers one day, but she's just so important in this case.
Yes, but there's also a big mistake in that case too. There's several mistakes, but the big one is not getting the video surveillance that night from the location to see what was exactly going on there.
Yeah, do we think it was erased? Or, I mean, do we think it was deliberately erased that night? Because, right, there were rumblings about how Peter Hackett, who is very, very, prominent character in the early days of this case, may have had access to it, may have deleted it. I don't know if that's been substantiated though.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything in regards to that per se, but I remember, Suffolk County didn't do themselves any favor when they were fighting that 9/11 tape from Shannon for so many years, right? And then when it finally came out, I was like, what were you guys fighting? But here's the other thing about Shannon Gilbert case, and I've mentioned this before. We don't know who the first officer on the scene was. We don't know if what he or she did, did. They just drive away and say, well, she was an escort. She came with a driver. The driver even left her. So, I'm out of here kind of thing. I mean, there's a lot to delve into about that first officer's response to the scene, what he or she found, who they spoke to. I mean, to me, that's an important part of that case.
Yeah, and really sad, she definitely deserved better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But her case is much different than the others too, right? She's the only one with a security. I think it's just too much of a too many risks involved at this point for like a suspect like Rex. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think, whether or not she was a victim in many ways that night,
Hmm.
even hearing just the honest accounts from Michael Pack, from his deposition, hearing how Joseph Brewer was trying to throw her out of this home, like, you know what I mean? Just the lack of humanity that was used with her by these men. I think like she should be here, it's all just really sad and unfortunate and reflects a larger attitude about women and women who are forced into sex work because of a variety of reasons and societal factors. I just think it's just really sad, whether she was a direct victim of Rex's or not. She deserved better and she was a victim.
Yep. Yeah, and most of the time it's not of their own doing. They get forced into certain situations because of a variety of reasons. The last minute I'm going to give you. Do we expect another bombshell in the next 6 months or so, do you think, in this case? You don't have to say who,
Always,
whatever, this and that.
always, of course. I don't know what it's going to be, but yes, because I just think both sides, maybe the defense, maybe the prosecution, are holding on to things to use in their arsenal in case of something. In case this DNA gets thrown out, hypothetically in the Fry hearing, I think Tierney's got something, to come up behind it. I think if it makes it in, maybe Michael Brown's got something teed up. So I think always with a case like this, with so many tentacles, we can expect more.
Yeah, I agree. Something's going to break. Something's going to be explosive. And I think the only thing the district attorney needs to work on is his poker face. Other than that, because I'd love to play poker with that guy. But yeah, he has too many tells, and I think he's sitting in the catbird seat, and he knows it.
He's doing such a great job. I know what you mean. He's got some little smirks and stuff, some pauses. And I'm like, all right, but maybe he's doing it on purpose. Maybe they're not tells. Maybe they're deliberate tells.
Maybe. Plus, we shall see. We shall
Attorneys
see.
are very theatrical. You know what I mean?
No, he could ride this right to the governor's house, as far as I'm concerned, at way this is going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alexis, this has been that hour just flew by. What a great
I
conversation.
know I could do it all day.
Yes, we could. But tomorrow, just announce again what's happening tomorrow with the podcast.
Tomorrow, episode 35 of Unraveled drops wherever you get your podcasts. Lots of interesting conversations. Joe, you're on tomorrow's episode. Josh Zeman of The Killing season, and just, a bunch of interesting voices where we really delve into these developments with Tanya and Tatiana and their newly returned identities.
Very good. And make sure you check out the Unraveled podcast and also the First Degree podcast. The links are in the comments and they're also in the show notes. So if you're watching this on the replay, you could just go to the show notes and you can find out everything you want about Alexis. Alexis, you hang on one second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you soon. Take
Bye.
care.